Sir, thank you for taking your time in your busy program to be with us. Sonny is well known in the cotton industry, but he is, of course, passionate about commercial leadership. He's passionate about sustainability. And also, I understand in this era of the Cricket World Cup, you're also passionate about cricket. So I hope you can share those passions with us today. We're absolutely delighted that you've taken the time to come to talk to us about meeting the demand for food and feed and its implications for the cotton sector. Sonny Verghese, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here this morning at the ICA conference. It is true what Bill said, that I have a long association with cotton. I started 37 years ago trying to set up a cotton plantation and an outgrower program in the east of Nigeria, the northeast of Nigeria. This was a 10,000 hectare primary nucleus cotton plantation, and it had about 10,000 farmers who were our outgrowers growing cotton on our behalf. We had a ginning facility associated with that, and we had a vegetable oil crushing facility. So we grew the lint and sent it to our textile mills, and we took the seed and converted it into edible oil, refined oil, and branded cooking oil. So that was about 37 years ago. We started Olam 34 years ago, and we have grown that business from a one country operation, one product operation, to a fairly large global food and agri business. We have roughly 41 billion US in top line or revenues. We employ about 90,000 people. We operate in about 67 countries. And after 34 years of the journey, we have now decided to reposition and reorganize the business by trying to focus and simplify our portfolio. So we have divided the company now, or separated the company now, into 3 new operating entities. OFI, Olam Food Ingredients, which is basically a play for the growing demand for plant-based, natural, fully sustainable, and granularly tasteable food ingredients and solutions. That entity is roughly 12 billion in size in terms of top line. It is headquartered now in the UK, in London. The second entity is Olam Agri, which is a market-leading global food, feed, and fiber agri-business. It's about 27 billion in top line. And the final business that we have is the remaining Olam Group, which is constituted into 3 component parts. There is a gestating business, our plantation businesses mainly. And then there is a ventures business where we are incubating sustainability and digital ventures. We have incubated 4 such ventures already, and we'll talk a little bit briefly about that at some other point in time in this presentation. And finally, we have carved out a legacy IT business as a separate technology business called MindSprint, with not only servicing Olam's captive requirements, but also taking this to third parties. So that's the Olam of today. And my comments and contribution today or sharing today will be largely informed by my own experiences and judgments and learnings that I've had in helping scale this business to global leadership. With that background, my topic today is the growing demand for food and feed. How do we meet the growing demand for food and feed? And what are the implications, therefore, of that to the cotton industry? Last year at this time, October of 2022, we had reached 8 billion people in the world in terms of population. Today, we are 8.1 billion people. So there are more mouths to feed. And our population is going to grow from 8.1 to roughly 11 billion by 2100, 10 billion by 2050. But if you look at the PIN code, that is clearly changing. Most of this increase in population is going to happen in the period from now to 2050 in Asia and Africa. But beyond that, almost all the growth from this 8 billion or 8.1 billion people today to 11 billion people is all going to happen in Africa. The 3 billion increased population is all going to be in Africa net. Europe will decline. Asia, which is at 4.84 billion people today, will grow to 5.3, but then as India ages and China is already aging, you will see a decline in population in Asia. And therefore, the incremental growth in population is going to be in Africa. When there are when there's growth in population, 3 billion delta, there's obviously going to be increased demand for food, feed, raw materials. So today we consume roughly 12.5 trillion calories of food. That's our current consumption. According to the WRI, World Bank, UNEP and UNDP, and the International Institute for Agronomy, they have forecasted that calorie consumption will grow as a result of population growth, per capita income growth, etc., by an additional 7.4 trillion calories, about 60% growth in calorie consumption between where we are today and where we expect to be by 2050. Low-income countries today, the average calorie consumption is 2,500 calories per day per capita. And in middle-income countries, it is about 3,000 calories per capita. And in high-income countries, including Singapore, where we are, it is about 3,600 calories per capita. So as population grows and as per capita income grows, in 1960, our per capita income worldwide average was $467 per capita. Today is $12,867 per capita. As per capita income grows, then per capita consumption grows, and there's a change in dietary habits from carbohydrate, cereal-based diet to a more protein and fats-based diet. So in 1960, when we had 3 billion population in this world, we had per capita meat consumption of 14.8 kilograms per capita. Last year, and therefore that year, we consumed 45 million tons of meat in 1960 to feed a 3 billion population with that per capita income. Last year, in 2022, meat consumption was 335 million tons from the 45 million tons it was in 1960. And the per capita consumption had grown from 14.8 to 42.3 kilograms per capita. And the forecast is that with population growth and per capita income growth changes, by 2050, we will need 455 million tons of meat is expected to be consumed to 500 million tons. And actually, the per capita consumption is only going to grow from 42 kilograms per capita to roughly 47 kilograms per capita. That we think is understated. And we all know to produce 1 kg of poultry meat, you need 2 kgs of feed grains. And to produce 1 kg of pork meat, we need 6 kgs of feed grains. And to produce a kg of beef, we need 8 kgs of feed grains. So as people become more prosperous, they will shift their dietary habits, more meat consumption will follow, more demand for food and feed will follow. And that will put a strain on the global agricultural system. The third is obviously we're having rapid revolution in urbanization. And urbanization in emerging markets are progressing at a very fast rate. So India is only 31% urbanized. China is already at 53% urbanization rates. Africa is very low urbanization at this point in time. So there's a revolution in urbanization rates across emerging markets. And as populations start urbanizing, the per capita consumption of food and feed and fiber, when populations are urbanizing, urban populations consume more per capita than rural populations do. And there's also a big change in demographic profiles. So the average age in Nigeria, 225 million population, is 14 years, average age. Saudi Arabia has got an average age of 30 years old. Younger populations consume more food, feed, and fiber than older populations do. So what does this mean? It means we have 4 big gaps that are emerging. There is a food demand gap, how much food is required to how much food is currently available, and therefore what is the growth in food and feed demand. I told you that is to the tune of growth in demand for food and feed of 60%, 7.4 trillion calories, additional calories production we need to find to meet that food demand gap. The second is we have a gap in area that needs to be planted to cater to that growth in calorie demand. So we need an additional, according to the studies, 593 million additional hectares to be planted, right? 593 million hectares against what we currently cultivate of 1.6 billion hectares, which means we have to find additional land, assuming the same trends in yield and productivity growth that we have observed over the last 20 years. If that yield and productivity growth trends continue in the future, then we need an additional 593 million hectares of land, which is a 37% increase on the land that we now cultivate of 1.6 billion hectares. Out of the 1.6 billion hectares that we cultivate, about 1.4 billion hectares is really for annual broadacre row crops, including cotton, soybean, corn, wheat, etc. And the balance is for permanent crops like cocoa and coffee and palm and rubber and all these permanent crops. So if you look at the total food production area, food and feed production area, from a harvested area standpoint, 1.6 billion hectares is cultivated or land under cultivation, 1.5 billion hectares is harvested area. Out of that 1.5 billion hectares of harvested area, food accounts for 93% of all the land that is cultivated for food crops. There are roughly 170 major food crops that are cultivated across the globe. And there are about 30 non-food crops. Cotton is one of the 30. But it's cotton, it's rubber, it's tobacco, it's hemp, it's jute. These are the non-food crops. There is competition between the land and area for food crops versus non-food crops. And in addition to this, we have 4.1 billion hectares of forest areas, of which 3.7 is replenishing forest areas. While we cultivate 1.6 billion hectares, we also have an additional 3.2 billion hectares under permanent pastures and meadows for livestock production. So only 29% of the total agricultural production land area is meant for food, feed, and non-food crops. 3.2 billion, which is almost 67% of the total agricultural land that we cultivate, is really meant for livestock production. So 67% of the land is cultivated for livestock, but that only accounts for 17% of our calories. We allocate 67% of the land for livestock production, but it only contributes to 17% of our calories. And that's not sustainable. So that is the second gap that we have, the land gap. So the food demand gap, the land gap. The third is the GHG emissions intensity, that gap. Today, agriculture accounts for 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. If you take land use change and if you take the food loss and waste included, that's almost close to 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions today are accounted for by agriculture. So today, we have 11 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions to produce all the food, feed, fiber that we consume. And by 2050, if we have to get to a 1.5 degree pathway, we have to reduce the 11 gigatons to 0. But to increase food production by 7.4 trillion calories by 2050, our greenhouse gas emissions at the current intensity of greenhouse gas emissions for the food that we produce will actually grow to 37 gigatons. Annually today, we use 45 gigatons, or we spend or expend 45 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture alone will grow from 11 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions to about 37 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. For 2 degrees pathway, we have to bring it down from the 37 gigatons to 4 gigatons. And for 1.5 degree pathway, we have to bring it down to 0. So how are we going to achieve it? There's a massive gap between 0 or 4 gigatons, the current 11 gigatons, and the forecasted 37 gigatons if you have to meet the demands of a growing population for food, feed, and fiber. So that is the third gap. The fourth gap is the nature and biodiversity collapse and what it means for food, feed, and fiber production. We have 9.6 million species of vertebrates, plants, insects in the world, and they're disappearing at an alarming rate. According to the Earth scientists, those who have come up with the planetary boundary concept, which is looking at 9 boundaries and what are the safe precautionary limits under which we need to be to have a sustainable future. One of those 9 planetary boundaries is the biosphere integrity, which means nature and biodiversity. And they have said that we cannot afford to lose more than 10 species for every million species that we own each year. Against that safe, precautionary planetary boundary condition, today we are losing about 1,000 species for every million species that we own each year. And let me give you an example of our own experience. 22-23 season in Australia for our almond business. We are the largest almond orchard owner in Australia. We need 5 beehives per acre to get the bees to pollinate those almonds. We had a varroa mite infestation and other problems. As a result, the bee population in Australia got decimated. We had only 45 to 50% of the normal bee population available. So we had to reduce the stocking rate in our almond orchards from 5 beehives per acre to 2.5 beehives per acre. Our yields have dropped 40%. And we made a profit warning this year to the market, to the street, that the bee issue in Australia is going to cost us $128 million pre-tax, $88 million post-tax. This tiny, fragile creature, which is one of the 9.6 million species that I talked to you about, governs our fate. All the massive capital investments that we have done there is all resting on the mood of this bee, which will not fly if the wind speeds are about 25 kilometers an hour, which will not fly if the temperatures are below 15 degrees centigrade, which will fly from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. I can't give it overtime and request it to fly more, right? So every tiny toad, tick, and creature in this planet has a specific role to play in controlling the microclimate, in controlling the water cycle, and all our futures are going to be dependent on that. So while we're all very familiar and aware about greenhouse gas emissions and climate action that needs to prevail for us to have a sustainable future, we're not as conscious about what nature and biodiversity can mean for us. I believe that the nature and biodiversity collapse is a far bigger problem than even greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So how do we all produce the more food, feed, and fiber that we need on a sustainable basis? We are losing about 25 billion tons of topsoil each year, which is about 12.8 million hectares. That is the size of Greece. We are losing that each year. And the 593 million hectares of additional land that we had to cultivate at current productivity is equivalent to 2 Indias put together. That's the additional land that you're going to find that you need. So it's not only about increasing food production to meet the growing demands, it's about how do you do it without destroying the planet. That's the challenge. What are the implications, therefore, of this for cotton? So cotton, we know between early 2000 and today, last 22 years, the cotton area under cultivation has been static. We had in 2000, 31.8 million hectares around the world in cotton cultivation. In 2022, we ended up with exactly the same number. Within the competing alternatives where farmers take a decision whether they plant cotton or soybean or corn or wheat, there is significant increase in share in corn and soybean compared to cotton. So corn acreage compared to cotton in 2000 was 137 million hectares against cotton's 31 million hectares. In 2022, the corn acreage is 206 million hectares. Significant growth. Cotton has stayed flat, right? Soybean acreage has gone from 75 million tons to 136 million tons. Wheat has declined, but corn and soybean have taken share. And this is for a variety of reasons. The first reason is the relative profitability and economics and the relative price ratios between cotton soybean and cotton corn. These have shifted very significantly and materially towards corn and soybean compared to cotton. And that is why, if you look at these 4 crops and you looked at the share of cotton in 1960, early 60, 63, 64, if you saw the share of cotton in this complex, it was 9% of the area under this complex was cotton. Now it is 5%. So there's a declining share of cotton acreage within these competing substitute crops that you can grow. The second thing that you're seeing is the relative profitability for the farmer. So the profitability for corn and wheat, for example, last 3-year average was $270 to $280 per acre. Cotton was $150. At $150, the returns are acceptable to the farmer. So cotton will maintain its share of acreage, but over time with the ethanol subsidies and renewable diesel mandates, particularly in the US, more and more acreage will shift to beans because it's going to be economically far more profitable. Cotton also has the challenge of losing share significantly to the other fibers, competing fibers, whether it's polyester staple, polyester fiber or viscose or rayon. All of these fibers are taking share from cotton because they have become relatively significantly cheaper. In early 2000, polyester staple fiber prices and cotton fiber prices, that ratio was 1:1. They were at parity in terms of price. Today, cotton is 2 times the price of polyester staple fiber. The share of cotton in the fiber complex has reduced from 46% to 23%. That's a dramatic decline. And with improvements in technology, if you can produce the competing alternative fibers more cheaply, then the substitution between cotton and polyester fiber will happen. So Joe, in his earlier presentation, Joe Nicosia, had said that we need to find a way of getting people to use more cotton and proselytize the benefits of having a sustainable fiber and the advantages and benefits of that. So for example, to grow cotton, you need the greenhouse gas footprint is 1.8 tons per hectare. That's pretty low amongst the competing crops. If you take the land use changes and the deforestation issues as a result of soybean cultivation, acreage shifting to soybean, et cetera, in the Amazon and Brazil and everything else, you will see that you can make a real good case of cotton being more sustainable. And if you look at the 1.8 tons of greenhouse gases that to cultivate cotton it takes, you can see that 3 component things account for 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions. 27% of the greenhouse gas emissions in cotton is as a result of how we till the land. Intense tilling, intense intercultural operations. That accounts for 27% of the greenhouse gas emission footprint in cotton. The second is the application of nitrogenous fertilizers. 24% of the greenhouse gas emissions in cotton is from the application of nitrogenous fertilizers. So if you identify the top 3 contributing factors that result in the greenhouse gas intensity in cotton, you can then attempt to intervene to manage those levers to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity in cotton. And if you compare cotton greenhouse gas intensity with polyester staple fiber or viscose or rayon, it will be a tiny fraction of what the greenhouse gas intensity of those alternative fibers are. But Mother Nature's back office is not set up. It is not issuing us those invoices for greenhouse gases that we use. Carbon is free today, so we all pollute indiscriminately. If water was free, electricity was free, we would do exactly the same thing. But they are priced at market rates. But for looking at externalities like biodiversity or greenhouse gases, those externalities are not priced in our cost of production. That's the cost that nature is bearing for us. And we are plundering nature. So FAO had conducted a study in 2015 to look at these externalities that are not priced in our cost of production. And they looked at the 4 major proteins that we produce. That is chicken, poultry meat, and lamb, and pork and beef. And they surveyed 80% of the world's production areas for contributing to the major production of these protein items. And they found that the externalities was roughly $1.87 trillion, which is the cost of the benefits that we derive from nature to produce this, for which Mother Nature has not issued us those invoices. And they looked at the 4 major crops that are grown: wheat, corn, rice, and soybean. And again surveyed 80% of the world's production areas and found the externalities cost was $1.17 trillion. Right? These were not priced. But a day is going to come when all this will get priced and costed. Singapore so far had a carbon tax of $5. Next year it is going to go to $23. And they have already given us a pathway that will go up much further over time. That will modify behaviors. Olam Agri and Olam Group. Let me start with Olam Agri. Olam Agri has got last year 52 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. 99% of this greenhouse gas emissions was scope 3 outside our control from our suppliers. Only 1% was scope 1 and 2, which we are directly controlling. But we have signed up to SBTi 1.5 degree pathway, which means we are committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. If you have to do that, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 4 odd million tons each year in Olam Agri. At $50 carbon price, that is $200 million of cost to me, which is about half my after-tax income in that group. Right? So there is no bigger priority for me as a CEO, for my CFO, for my management and leadership team, but to fix this. Because this is going to be real. These externalities will get embedded in our costs, and we have to pay that cost. If not now, tomorrow. With this, I'll just stop my comments and give you time to ask questions. We got, I don't know, how much time do you have for questions?
We have 30 minutes.
Okay, so we've got a lot of time for questions. So just before we start the questions, I want to know how many of you in this audience know your carbon footprint? Okay, I guess there's about 200 odd people here. We've got one person who knows his carbon footprint. This is not trying to put you guys down, so please don't get insulted by these questions. How many of you know your water footprint? How many liters of water do you consume a day? Couple of liters, more or less? The UN says for our household purposes, our bathing and brushing our teeth and shaving and all that, we need 50 to 55 liters of water per day. We drink 1 or 2 liters per day, depending on each person. But in Singapore, we consume 3,600 calories per day. A rough rule of thumb is for every calorie that you consume, you need 1 liter of water. So if today in the hotel your breakfast was 2 eggs sunny side up, and if you had a cup of coffee, and you had a bowl of cereal, a strip or 2 strips of bacon, then the total water consumption this morning at your breakfast was between 1,200 and 1,400 liters of water. Right? So that's our water consumption. How many of you know your waste footprint? So 195 countries have come together under the Paris Accord and committed that they will do whatever is required to make sure the global warming stays within 2 degrees centigrade, but preferably 1.5 degrees centigrade. We cannot switch on a TV today, read a newspaper, or look at a media article without seeming like you're walking through the book of Revelations. One disaster after the other, more prolonged episodes, more frequent episodes of storms, fires, extreme heat, and high temperatures. We got to wake up. Climate change is real. 99% of the Nobel laureates confirm that. 97% of the world's scientists confirm that. But how can we hope to change the world when we won't be the change that we want to see in others? If I asked you the question, do you know your company's annual revenues, or its annual profits, or the number of employees? Most of you in this room will raise your hands. So how can we change the world if we can't change ourselves? I believe we need 5 levels of change. We need to first change ourselves. Second, we need to change our companies. Third, we need to change our sector, because one good actor in a sector is not going to do the trick. And that is why we launched something called TRACT along with our competitors. The agri-commodity industry is intensely competitive. We hate each other's guts. We never come together on anything. We never talk to each other. Unless the world is literally burning down. Well, guess what? The world is literally burning down. We need to come together in unnatural, pre-competitive coalitions on how can the cotton sector become more sustainable to meet the growing demands for fiber without destroying the planet. The fourth is we need to have government and policymakers come to the party and make sure that there's mandatory disclosure of our carbon footprint, our water footprint, our waste footprint, our impact on biodiversity and nature, and all of the other aspects which we think is as important as reporting financial and economic capital, including a carbon tax. And finally, policymakers and academicians have to come up. 70% of the solving the problem for climate or nature does not exist today. So new research and innovation and breakthroughs are needed to find 70% of the solutions, right? So we need to make that happen. And finally, civil society and companies, private sector will need to come and act together. Civil society sees companies as evil. Companies see civil society as troublemakers. We never agree, never come together on anything. But when you are faced with this kind of existential challenges of climate emergency, collapse of nature and biodiversity, growing inequality of income, wealth, well-being, and opportunity, you cannot continue with business as usual. Okay, sorry. Questions, please. Oh, sorry, okay. Okay, so first is what is Olam doing to educate suppliers to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions? So we have now, as I said, 99% of our greenhouse gas emissions footprint in Olam Agri is scope 3. So we are developing 63 projects, a detailed climate action playbook by which we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 32 million tons between now and 2030. I don't think all the projects will happen exactly as we intended and exactly as we have planned. And when I say these are our scope 3 projects, this includes our suppliers. So we work with our suppliers to make sure that we can reduce scope 3. The second, is this in some order of voting? So it's just,
No, they're not, I'm afraid.
okay, so I can just, okay. Can supply of cotton be increased in future due to African countries shifting to GMO seeds? It's a good question. Today, about 80% of the world's cotton is under BT cotton, and that has resulted in why, although cotton acreage has been flat for the last 22 years, cotton production has actually gone up. There is weather-related disruption in cotton production, but otherwise cotton production has gone up. One of the contributory factors is that more and more of the world has shifted to BT cotton. But there is still Africa and other parts of the world that have not yet done that. So if you look at Australia, Brazil, China, and the US, which are all almost entirely BT cotton, they account for only, I think, 23% of the world's cotton area, but produce 26% of the world's cotton area, but produce 56% of the world's cotton. India and Pakistan, which have 42% of the world's planted area under cotton, only accounts for 28% of the world's cotton, or 23% of the world's cotton production. And Africa, which accounts for 10% of the world's cotton area, only produces 5% of the world's cotton. So there is room to move to BT cotton. There's room to go to more irrigated cotton farming. 72% of the world's cotton area is now irrigated, but there is scope to get more irrigation. Irrigated yields are roughly twice that of unirrigated yields. But the full benefits of cotton, BT cotton, because if you see the average yields in India is about 460 kilograms per acre. The yields in Australia are 2,100 kilograms per acre, right? And if you look at China, 1.9 tons per acre, 1,900 kilograms per acre. So if you, there's a massive yield gap. Africa is 480 kilograms per acre average. So there's a massive yield gap. So you can grow, but it is not only about BT cotton, it's about using the right farming practices. So India's yields are still low despite a big shift towards BT cotton because the agricultural practices in terms of the application of the the nutrients and the fertilizers and the agrochemicals are not optimal. And therefore, you're not getting the full potential value of what the BT cotton can therefore do for you. Yeah, organic cotton is, so the area under agricultural production, total, including pastures and meadows, has only grown at 0.1% for the last 20 years, CAGR, only 0.1%. But if you remove pastures and meadows, they've grown at 1.1% for food crops and 1.4% per annum for pasture crops, for food crops and non-food crops. 1% for food crops and 1.4% for pasture crops. But organic cotton, the growth rate has been double digits, but it starts with a small base. That will continue, and as consumers continue to ask more questions, the fabric that I'm going to be, or the garment that I'm going to be using, if it is climate positive, it is nature positive, it is livelihood positive, I'm willing to pay a premium, and that will happen. But as Joe said, we need to do something as an association, as individual companies, as a sector, on how we can promote why cotton is a sustainable fiber, and therefore, why it should demand a premium. And part of the equation of demanding a premium is a lot of the cotton in many of the emerging markets are smallholder farm cultivated cottons. And 95% of them live below a living income level. 55% of them live below the poverty line of $2.15 a day, but 95% of them live below a living income level, which is roughly 4 times the minimum poverty line. So if you can uplift farmer incomes, and then you can offer a fabric or a garment or whatever to your consumers, saying that it is carbon positive or climate positive, it is nature positive, it is livelihood positive, you can get a larger share of the customer's wallet, but you can also get some pricing power and premium. What is your main suggestion to the cotton industry to do to improve its sustainability and get a bigger share of the fiber market share? Is we have to walk the talk. And therefore, we have to make sure that we are able to carry the whole organization. And we have to speak the language. Your board needs a different language to want to come along the sustainability journey. So if the board has to say, the board will say that if your passion is sustainability, you retire and do this at your own time and your own cost. If you want the company to do this, tell us how is it going to benefit the company and how is it going to benefit the shareholders in the long term. So you have to say that if you're more sustainable, you're less risky. If you're less risky, you'll be assigned a lower cost of capital, which means for the same dollar of future income, you will be valued differently and better. That language they understand. Our employees understand a very different language. They want to feel inspired working for a company because they're spending a third of their waking hours in a company. And they want to know it means something, it is making a difference. So how do you give them a purpose that they feel inspired about? And embedding that purpose in the company, that I'm doing this, I'm a cotton procurement manager in some part of the world, or a ginner in another part of the world. Well, how does this help in changing my company, in changing the cotton industry, and in changing the agricultural sector, and potentially changing the world? Then they want to wake up in the morning and come to work. So the language for different stakeholders has to be that the sustainability journey from their perspective and from their lens makes sense so that they want to be part of this journey and want to be aligned. Okay. Will Olam be using price to incentivize your growers who contribute to your scope? Absolutely. Because we are sharing the value of the carbon because you're monetizing the carbon. So if they're helping us reduce the carbon, we will be sharing the value of the carbon that credits that we are getting or carbon that we are monetizing with the farmer who's shifting his practices to reduce that carbon intensity as a scope 3 emission for the company, as a scope 1 emission for him. And that's only possible if we can share the benefits of that. So we are hoping whether it's soil carbon or carbon greenhouse gas emissions in general, we can share the benefits of that transition with our farmers. Of course, in scope 1 and 2, we have to do that directly. So only 26% of all our power that we generate in the company across all our manufacturing plants and farming operations is from renewable fuels today. So we want to take that to 50% by 2030. So we have a program in every facility of ours, how we will shift from non-renewable energy sources to renewable energy sources. And that is a program that we are implementing. In order to reduce water consumption is a function of how you improve water usage efficiency. Different crops require different amounts of water to grow. So almond is a very water intensive crop. We need 12.5 megaliters of water per acre to irrigate almonds. And water in California, where 84% of the world's almonds are grown, Australia, where 10% of the world's almonds are grown, are mightily expensive. They're very water scarce regions and very, very expensive. So you have to maximize the crop per drop of water. So we have used IoT and other technologies, probes, to basically monitor the water situation on each tree. And through our drip irrigation systems, etc., only release the amount of water the tree needs for the specific amount of time and duration it needs. And that has allowed us to significantly improve water usage efficiency in almonds by almost 22-23% over the last few years. So how can you improve water usage efficiency for different crops using technology and harnessing technology would be the key of how you can make it more water efficient. I think we have addressed the next question. How would you recommend cotton sells a story on sustainability? Who would pay for this marketing? Would it be Olam merchants? It has to be, firstly, in almonds and other places, why it is seen as a wonder food is really because of the Almond Board. The Almond Board of California has done a phenomenal job in marketing the nutritional value and why almonds and walnuts are superfoods, right? So if cotton can be grown sustainably, and it's a natural fiber as a competing alternative to synthetic fibers, I think we can make a case for why within the fiber complex, cotton is the most sustainable fiber. But somebody has to take the ownership to create and convince consumers and customers of that story. And therefore, I think ICA has a role to play, ICAC has a role to play, and all the cotton bodies around the world have a role to play. And that's why you are all members and you pay membership fees, and some of these bodies, I'm told, are reasonably well capitalized. They got to put that capital to work on behalf of the industry. And of course, companies have to do their bit. And the sector as a whole, you have to do your bit as a sector, as a pre-competitive coalition. Well, it's good to come and have a jamboree in the annual conferences. Beyond that, you have to use these platforms on how you can nudge each other to cooperate and create these coalitions, these unnatural coalitions, which normally you wouldn't want to do, unnatural coalitions to address a problem which ultimately is in our self-interest. Okay. Yeah, what is the impact of high interest rates on the food, feed, and fiber demand? If you remember anything of what Joe Nicosia said in his presentation, there's only one message you should take home from that: the burden of carry, right? And who is going to pay for that burden of carry? For Olam Agri, in 2021, we had about $76 million thereabouts of total interest expenses. In 2022, as interest rates went up, many increases in interest rates, our interest expenses went up from 76 to 142, almost double. In 23, this year, we're expecting our interest costs to be $315 million US, from just $76 million in 21. Not because our business has grown so much, it hasn't. It has grown modestly, but it hasn't grown so much. So really, if the interest cost burden is not shared by the grower, which means lower realizations for the grower, and not shared by a customer or mill, and therefore higher prices for them. If that entire burden has to be only borne by the traders, then this system will fail and it will break. So I think that burden sharing of what we have all seen as the fastest, steepest increase in interest rates in history. We haven't seen interest rates go up by so many times and by so much in such a short duration of time. Today, the disproportionate burden of the carry is being borne by the traders, and that is not sustainable. So our EBITDA is going up, our EBIT is going up, but our profits, our net income is going down dramatically because we have all this interest cost to bear. And our shareholders and board will say, why are you in the cotton business? Resources are scarce, working capital is expensive, so you need to allocate every dollar of working capital to those crops and products where your customers understand this and are willing to pay for it. So companies are therefore under pressure, and I think how we are going to allocate the burden of this extraordinary situation of high carry between the various industry participants is an important factor. Okay, are there any questions from the floor? All right, if not, thank you for your patience, and I wish you all a sustainable future in transforming the cotton industry. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attention. Sunny, publicly, a great thank you for communicating so wonderfully, clearly, and effectively to this audience.